Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Shake your head. Okay. I'm Loretta Pearson with the Chicago branch. Welcome to our program tonight. It's great to see so many people interested in what's being done in Cook County, and I hope in all the collar counties too, to combat human trafficking. When I started researching sex trafficking a few months ago, I discovered some books on the subject that were written by two Chicago women, amazingly enough. So, of course, I had to reach out and read them. I'm going to share my screen right now so that you can see. I hope I can do this. Well, I lost. There it is. I want to share the list of books. Hopefully, you can all see that. The first book that I read from this list was the one at the top, Leaving Breezy Street, written by Brenda Myers Powell. It's a very explicit account of her own life as a young prostitute and her eventual recovery from that life. I also learned later that in 2008, she and another woman, Stephanie Daniels Wilson, founded the Dreamcatcher Foundation in Chicago. And their purpose is to help young women escape the sex industry. And I believe they are still functioning now. The next book I read was at the bottom of the list there, Saving Bernice by Professor Jody Raphael, who at the time was a professor at the DePaul University College of Law. She's written, as you can see, several books. Her writings tend to be in-depth interviews with women who have been involved in sex trafficking. Hopefully, and I think most of them have recovered. And then, stalker that I am, I searched out these women and I was able to get a hold of Professor Raphael. We had a very good conversation about the work that she's done over a period of years. She's not actively involved now. So what she did was direct me to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and the trail rather, led finally to Elisa Munoz, our speaker tonight. I'm very happy to present Elisa. She has an imposing title. She is the Human Trafficking Victim Witness Coordinator with the Human Trafficking Unit of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Prior to this position, she worked with the Salvation Army Stop It program, and I think she's going to share some of that with us tonight too. Elisa's unit provides support and advocacy to survivors of human trafficking as they work through the legal process. And by the way, human trafficking, is not just sex trafficking, it's also labor trafficking. She and her team connect victims to trusted service providers who address the needs of those people. Tonight, we're going to learn about the public's crucial role in recognizing and helping to prevent or interrupt trafficking. You'll probably have questions as Elisa speaks, and I'm going to ask you to please hold them until the end. We'll have a Q&A session the last few minutes of our program. Okay, I'm going to stop jabbering. I need to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to introduce Elisa Munoz.
Thank you so much, Loretta, for having me and for the introduction and for the recommendations of books I'll definitely be reading. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Loretta said, my name is Elisa Munoz. She encompassed my title very well. I'm the Victim Witness Coordinator with the Human Trafficking Unit. In a nutshell, I provide victim services to victims involved in cases being prosecuted at the state level within Cook County, as well as investigations that we have ongoing. I've been in the anti-trafficking field for a little over 4 years now. Prior to that, I worked with sexual assault victims as well as domestic violence victims. So thank you for joining us for tonight's presentation, Human Trafficking, a Community's Guide to Understanding Sex and Labor Trafficking. Another aspect of my role is that I co-lead the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force with my task force partners. Here you'll see a graphic structure of our task force and how we function. We started in the fall of 2012. We're a federally funded task force. The type of funding we received is called the Enhanced Collaborative Model. The purpose of that model and of the task force and the funding we get is basically to make sure that law enforcement and social service providers have a close-knit network of referrals, so that when we're encountering these victims, we can work together on investigations, on prosecuting the case, and making sure that we're getting the victims the services they need following their experience. So at the very top here, you'll see the core team. That includes my office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and the Salvation Army Stop It program. They serve Cook County and several of the collar counties. And basically the purpose of that is to make sure that cases are being prosecuted at the state and federal levels, and that we have Stop It as our go-to to connect victims to longer term services, case management, any of their basic needs following their experience. And you'll see here that included in our steering committee, we have various levels of law enforcement, legal service providers, victim service providers, child welfare agencies, hospital, healthcare providers, really any professionals that are encountering victims that receive specialized training on working with victims that can cater to the needs that they have. They're more than likely involved in our task force. And it's great to have a network where we know that the services are going to be victim-centered, they're high-quality services, and that we can assure the victim that they're going to a service provider that we trust and that they can trust. A little bit about what we've accomplished since our inception. These are the most recent statistics that we have up until 2021. We've had 193 defendants indicted in 104 cases at the state level, 63 traffickers in 43 federal cases. We've helped over 300 victims, and we've trained more than 17,000 professionals on human trafficking training, which would include all of you, but that's just a brief snapshot of what we've accomplished most recently. So what are we aiming to do here today? Today we're going to talk about the definitions of sex and labor trafficking and what makes a situation a trafficking situation. We're going to talk about different misconceptions and stereotypes that perpetuate the two forms of trafficking, and we're going to understand some societal and individual risk factors that could make someone vulnerable to being trafficked, and signs that could indicate that something's going on. And this may seem like it's very baseline information, just understanding the basics about human trafficking, but that really is the first step to identifying more victims, is for more people to be aware and educated about how it really happens. Defining human trafficking. So what you see here are the federal definitions of sex and labor trafficking. Starting with sex trafficking. Sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person performing the act is under the age of 18. So we're going to be talking about force, fraud, and coercion a lot in this presentation. Those are basically the main elements that make a situation trafficking and that make it exploitative, but we'll get into that in the next few slides. I also want to highlight the or here, or in which the person performing the act is under the age of 18. In the past, minors were considered like juvenile prostitutes, or they could have even been arrested for engaging in the sex trade. But as of 2010, there was an act called the Illinois Safe Children's Act, which essentially shifted the focus to protection for minors that are engaged in the sex trade. Minors can't legally consent to sex, therefore they can't legally consent to selling sex. And we know that if there is a minor engaged in the sex trade, they're likely being influenced and patronized by an adult. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, those minors are considered sex trafficking victims. Moving on to labor trafficking. Labor trafficking in which force, fraud, or coercion is used to recruit, harbor, transport, obtain, or employ a person for labor or services in involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So any form of labor or service or work that's against their will. Peonage refers to a situation in which people are made to work off a debt through their labor, like pay off a debt through work that's some form of work that's being done. Debt bondage basically refers to a situation where someone may impose a certain debt onto their victim, and then they're constantly incurring various fees that add on to the debt, and it's basically unrealistic that the victim is ever going to be able to pay it off in the situation that they're in. Where does exploitation occur? So where are we seeing these two forms of sex and labor trafficking? Sex trafficking can occur within street prostitution, brothels, massage parlors, online exploitation, hotels and motels, pornography, stripping, truck stops, and gangs. You'll see that some of these have an asterisk that basically denotes that sex and labor trafficking can occur within those venues. You'll notice that some of these locations, such as street-based prostitution, brothels, in the porn industry and within strip clubs, those are commercial sex venues as it is, like they are already sexual in nature, and which basically makes them a target for traffickers to target victims, recruit people, because they already are engaged in commercial sex within those industries. Labor trafficking can occur within farm work, cleaning services, construction, domestic servitude, factories, restaurants, beauty salons, nail salons, traveling sales crews, carnivals, and family-owned businesses. A lot of these are businesses that we may patronize often and maybe not think twice about the individuals that are working there, or if we're thinking about farm work and construction, or like cleaning services, those might be positions or individuals that are overlooked or not given like a second glance. These are positions that might be staffed by individuals with language barriers or that are foreign nationals, right? That could make them vulnerable to a exploitative situation. So what does forced fraud and coercion look like? Like how are people being kept in these situations or recruited into these trafficking situations? Via force. And it could be all three of these elements could be present, or it could just be one. All three are not required for it to legally be considered a trafficking case. Or it could be two and not all three. Force can include physical restraint, kidnapping, rape, or beatings, constraint, confinement, and starvation, or assault against family members, right? If someone is facing physical abuse, physical danger, if they know that their trafficker has access to weapons, if they've been threatened with weapons, that's how a trafficker is compelling them to remain in that situation, by instilling fear in them, and threatening their safety if they weren't to comply with what the trafficker is requiring, or if they would try to get out of the situation. Fraud can include false and deceptive offers, promises of employment, marriage, or a better life, unexpected changes in conditions, compensation, or debt. So someone could be presented with a certain job offer that later changes. That applies to both sex and labor trafficking. A trafficker might approach a victim, a sex trafficking victim, we see it very often, in a romantic way, or make promises to them of like a better life together, that they could have everything that they ever wanted, and that the trafficker basically knows what's best if the victim, basically just complies with what the trafficker is saying. Coercion. Coercion could include threats of serious harm to or physical restraint of a person, document confiscation, psychological manipulation, or threats of abusing the legal process. So even if, in a specific situation, if someone hasn't been physically harmed, the threat that that's going to happen, or just the idea that this could happen, is enough for something, for a situation to be considered a trafficking situation. If traffickers often confiscate their victims' passports, social security cards, IDs, this is a form of control that basically prohibits the victim from leaving freely of their own will. It gives the trafficker access to personal information about the victim. Because if the victim were to try to flee and go start over somewhere else, the trafficker has all these documents that would allow them to get on a plane, buy a bus ticket, like basic IDs and things that we need every day. Threats of abusing the legal process, that's also relevant and often used by traffickers in both forms of trafficking. If the victim's a foreign national, they could threaten the victim with immigration, or even not. If it's a U.S. citizen, the trafficker could tell the person that they're going to get in trouble too for engaging in the sex trade, or basically just imply that there'll be legal repercussions in some way. And lastly, coercion could include anything that would cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm or restraint against them. So human trafficking, what it isn't. These are some images that might come to mind or that we see in the media when we're talking about human trafficking. You'll see the two images up here, mass amounts of people being transported from one country to another. These two images actually depict human smuggling. A lot of the times trafficking and smuggling are considered the same thing, but they are actually not. Smuggling is a crime against a border. Someone can agree to be smuggled from one country to another, but trafficking is a crime against a person's human rights and their free will. Someone can't agree to be trafficked. I think the common reason why these two are often conflated with each other is that someone can agree to be smuggled, and that could then make them vulnerable to being trafficked. Smuggling could lead to trafficking. For example, if the coyote or the person that brought them over later leads them into a situation that's a labor trafficking situation or sex trafficking, where they're being exploited, or could hold them in a debt bonded situation if the trafficker is imposing fees related to the smuggling that happened. You might also see this, I think this is an old myth that was going around, but that traffickers brand their victims with barcodes. Branding is common as far as tattoos, but we're not seeing barcodes very often. This person's hands being bound is included basically to show that physical restraint just isn't always required. Trafficking victims are not being locked away, unable to move about freely. Oftentimes they will have freedom of movement, or it's happening in plain sight. It's not something that's hidden in some sort of underground industry. It's happening in businesses that we patronize every day and within our own communities. These last two images basically refer to myths that traffickers are kidnapping children in vans, or that traffickers are strangers, or that this image is of a zip tie, or that cars are being marked at random. There's a lot of myths on social media about women being targeted in Target at random. But the truth is that trafficking traffickers normally strategically target vulnerable victims, build a relationship and build trust with them over time in order to exploit them. And it typically doesn't happen at random. There's normally some relationship or form of trust that exists there prior. Additional myths and misconceptions. Let's see, I'm going to jump around a little bit here. Survivors will immediately ask for help or self-identify as a victim. A lot of the times people think, well, this is such a horrible crime. How would someone not want help? or not want immediately to get out of that situation or not consider themselves a victim. The reality is that the grooming that happens is so pervasive from the traffickers that oftentimes victims might feel like they're in the situation willingly. Or, you know, they could be hesitant to ask for help from social service providers or be fearful of the police, or they may not be ready or safe enough to leave their situation at that moment. There's multiple different reasons why survivors might not immediately want help or be open to help or even consider themselves a victim. And oftentimes they realize how they were victimized and targeted after the fact. So that is a myth, and this idea that trafficking victims are waiting to be rescued isn't always the case, which is why it's good to have social service providers that can basically help victims where they're at, right? We might encounter someone that's engaging in the sex trade that admits to that, and we know that there's someone in their life that's controlling, and we're still going to be there for them, be supportive to them, provide services, just in the event that later more information comes out that, you know, could give us information that the person is being trafficked, and we would help them like figure out exactly what's going on or what help they need. Let's see. Moving on, initial consent to perform labor or sex work means that it's not trafficking. That is false. Even if someone agreed to engage in the sex trade at first, or agreed to work at a job that they thought was ideal and would be well paid, that's irrelevant, because as soon as they're being forced, defrauded, or coerced to remain in that situation, and they can't stop working at that job or stop engaging in the sex trade against their own will, that is when it becomes a trafficking situation. So even if they willingly entered into that situation at first, once they're unable to leave on their own or stop when they want to, that's when the trafficking comes into play. Some of these we already covered. I want to move on to all sex work is human trafficking. This is also false, right? Because someone could willingly be engaged in the sex trade. They could agree or willingly be participating in the sex trade at their own free will, not be trafficked. Some may believe that sex work is inherently exploitative, but we should also think about the circumstances that someone might choose sex work under, right? Because it can occur on a spectrum, basically. Like, are they doing it out of survival? Are they doing it to find somewhere to stay? It really varies. But again, sex work is human trafficking when someone is forcing, defrauding, or coercing that person to remain in that situation, and they feel like they're not able to stop when they want to. I'm going to breeze through some of these, but now we're going to go over some social risk factors. So like the social climate of our culture and our society that makes trafficking, that perpetuates trafficking, right? And then we're going to get into some individual risk factors that would make someone vulnerable. So we live in a society that's plagued by racism, sexism, and misogyny. If we're already living in this culture where certain populations are marginalized or are already disproportionately impacted by violence, or maybe aren't given the same services, the same privileges as other groups, as other races or other sexes, those create like a social climate that makes people more vulnerable to violence, to exploitation, especially sexual violence, which disproportionately happens to be women and girls of color, children, which are also the most at-risk groups for trafficking. Homophobia and transphobia, if people are being marginalized and outcasted by their family, and they're lacking support, that could all lead to isolation that traffickers could prey on. Jumping around a little bit, glorification of pimp culture. You know, we hear the word pimp in music, in Halloween costumes, in movies, and you know, the word is even thrown around as like a positive term to refer to a man. He's a pimp, he's a player, but people don't really think twice about what this word actually means, and that it actually refers to someone that's exploiting people for profit. Lack of accountability in labor practices, materialism, and consumerism, market for cheap goods. We live in a society where we're constantly consuming. We're not thinking about where our products come from. Everyone wants the newest things. You know, other countries are basically employing people for such little money that labor trafficking is happening globally, and people are being exploited worldwide to make products that we are constantly changing out, like the newest phone or clothes. And we're not really thinking about the people involved in that, and where our products are coming from. Individual risk factors. So what are some things in a person's life that could make them more vulnerable to being trafficked? If they have a history of sexual abuse, physical abuse, or neglect, that could cause shame and isolation and change the way that victims are basically bonding and relating with people in their lives that traffickers could prey on. They may feel like violence is inevitable in their life, or that you know, they may place their worth on their sexuality or on their physical person, that you know, could be exploited by a trafficker. If we're talking about an individual who's a runaway or homeless, or considered a throwaway, right? Maybe they're involved in the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system, or have been incarcerated. Those are all individuals that could be lacking support, have limited options, especially the LGBTQ community as well. Mental health issues and lack of economic opportunity. Both of those could affect how someone understands like a person's intentions, or I'm sorry, specifically mental health issues. It could isolate somebody, affect the way that they're understanding a person's intentions. They could also be very isolated, which I mentioned. Developmental and learning disabilities, unaddressed trauma, lack of economic opportunity, or being undocumented is also a huge risk factor. Pathways to entry. So how are people getting involved in trafficking? How are they being victimized by trafficking situations? So oftentimes when we hear about child trafficking, I don't think people really are aware that oftentimes children are trafficked by their own family members, by their parents. It could be any adult around them. It doesn't need to be their parents, especially if there's someone using drugs in the home. Those children are particularly at risk for being traded for their substance, basically for the parent to meet their need. They could be recruited through violence and force, through kidnapping, seduction and coercion, false advertising for model, acting, or dancing opportunities. In those situations, traffickers might prey on like a person's aspirations. You know, a victim might feel special that a trafficker, you know, sees potential in them, or the trafficker could lead them to believe that they have some sort of connection that could help them get into these industries, and really their plan is to exploit them the whole time. They could be recruited by peers. If we're thinking about young people as well, they could be recruited by their own classmates, people of the same gender, even their own friends. That happens a lot as well. Internet enticement through social media apps, chat rooms, and profile sharing sites, false advertising through false employment agencies, or offers of a better option or a better life. And when I think about the victims that I've worked with, oftentimes their traffickers are people that they share kids with, you know, someone they've considered their boyfriend, people that they've met online, or even their own family members. This is the child sex trafficking on and off ramp. So basically, this basically explains, I know it's hard to see, I'm going to send it out afterward, but it basically explains the factors that could lead children to being victimized by sex trafficking and the remedies that we could employ to try to fix the issue. So a few of the on ramps could be poverty and homelessness, immigration status, adverse childhood experiences, historical trauma, lack of parental involvement or discrimination, lack of adequate education. Some of the remedies are trauma responsive systems and staff, community-based treatment services, legal services such as immigration relief and or expungement, culturally appropriate and accessible diversion programs. And this is from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'll be sure to send that out so you all could take a closer look. These are 3 different graphics that basically explain situations that children could be victimized by trafficking. The first one says, my mom got a new boyfriend. He kicked me out. Someone comes and says, I have a place for you to stay. You won't have to deal with him again. So oftentimes these traffickers are providing, they're filling some sort of need that the victim has, right? It could be buying them gifts. It could be meeting their immediate basic needs that we all have as humans, like shelter, food, just very baseline needs. Like in this situation, this child was homeless and this person's offering him somewhere to stay. That is how quickly it could happen and how quickly someone could be trafficked. But then on the other hand, they could be offering them, like I said, gifts, drugs. They could be offering a feeling of that they fit in, or friendship or love. But we'll get into that a little bit more too. This one says, my uncle's been touching me since I was 5. He said it's no big deal. Someone says, you don't have to do that for free. You're more vulnerable than that. So in that situation, the child's trauma history is being preyed upon. The child probably carries a lot of shame, and this person is taking advantage of that. This bottom left graphic says, my mom's addicted to drugs and we're out of money. Someone says, we're going to go visit some nice men who are going to help us. Be a good daughter. So who are the traffickers? As I mentioned earlier, pimp and trafficker are synonyms. Pimp is a word that's a little more normalized in our society, but they mean the same thing. It could be a boyfriend, father, mother, brother, an uncle, a coach, a teacher, anyone with control over a person, even their peer. It can be a smuggler or a coyote who helped bring someone to the country, men and women of varying ages, any ethnicity or race, anyone who benefits or facilitates from the commercial sexual exploitation of a minor or adult through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, anyone who benefits from the exploitation of a worker in the labor force. So maybe the media, or when you hear the word pimp or a trafficker, a certain like prototype of a person might come to mind. But I really encourage you to challenge that, because I have seen them be anyone. They could be close in age to the victim, you know, a child's own parents. It really could be any person with those intentions. How people are controlled. So what is making compelling victims to stay in these trafficking situations, and making them so fearful to leave, right? Because we talked about how physical restraint is not always present, it's not always required, and psychological abuse and manipulation is enough to keep to prove that trafficking is taking place for it to be considered a crime, but it's also I think the most pervasive of the forms of abuse and the most common. People could be controlled through physical restraint, monitoring, and psychological coercion, right? Traffickers might let victims move out and about, but they could monitor them closely or control certain locations that they could go to, or require them to bring proof back of where they've been. Something I've seen a lot too is like constant phone calls and constant texts from traffickers, checking in on the victim, and you know, them having to report back on where they are. They are controlled through violence, threats, verbal abuse, drugs, and occasional indulgences. I think it's very common for traffickers to introduce drugs to their victims, but that's also a way that traffickers could prey on victims is by providing the drugs to the victim and keeping them under their control in that way. Because if the traffickers, you know, just constantly providing the drugs, if the victim works, you know, that could compel them to stay in the situation. Occasional indulgences. So if we're thinking about the cycle of violence, how there's an explosive phase of violence, and then like this honeymoon period where a victim might, you know, treat a victim to go get their nails done or buy them gifts or just do anything, you know, buy them a meal, anything that makes them feel special, like for that brief moment, could just instill that little hope in a victim, that things might get better, that this person does care about them, or that, you know, all the terrible things that were happening prior maybe aren't going to be how it continues, which is not typically the case. Demonstrating omnipotence. A trafficker might convince a victim that they have godlike abilities, or that they know what the victim's thinking, or that they know who they spoke to when they weren't in their presence, or that they know that the victim is like thinking about leaving them, or, you know, anything like that. And I think that paired with monitoring, or if the victim has cameras on them, a lot of the times they're physically like being watched and controlled by the trafficker. Degradation, enforcing trivial demands, and isolation. If the trafficker is verbally abusing them, basically breaking down their self-confidence, any sense of self-worth that they have, they might not feel like they're able to get out of the situation, or that they'll ever get away from this person. And if they're cutting off every source of support that the victim might have had, or any trusted person or a safe person that could actually help them get out of the situation, eventually the trafficker is the only person that they have contact with, which gives them more control. Monopolization of perception, that's commonly referred to as gaslighting. They could tell them that didn't happen, you know, you're making that up, things like that. Induce debility and exhaustion, making them physically weak or exhausted to the point that they are not physically able to get out of the situation. They might control the amount that they work, or not let them take breaks, even to use the bathroom or to eat meals, until they've made a certain amount or worked a certain amount that the trafficker decides. This is the power and control wheel. One of these that you may have seen does exist for domestic violence. This is the power and control wheel for sex and labor trafficking. It basically lists out different categories of power and control that traffickers will impose on their victims. And I'll make sure to send this out too for your reference. Obstacles to leaving. So we talked about why a victim might not immediately accept help or be willing to leave their situation. They might be unaware of what's being done to them as a crime. They may be fearful and distrusting of helping professionals, like we talked about. They may have feelings of love projected onto the trafficker. They may fear for their family and their friends, or they may feel that they're responsible for the situation that they're in, and that it's their fault and that they chose to be there. So what are some red flags? We know what trafficking is, we know where it happens, how it happens, but how would you know if someone could be in a trafficking situation? There may be evidence of controlling relationships, like I said, repeated phone calls or worry about displeasing their partner. There may be signs of physical and sexual violence, such as unexplained bruises, black eyes, or cuts or marks. They may have unexplained valuables that they wouldn't be able to afford otherwise, like jewelry or a cell phone, that seems out of the ordinary, especially for young people. They're not in control of their own money. They may use lingo or slang from the sex trade, such as calling their boyfriend daddy, or saying that someone is their sister wife, or using the word tricks. Those are all to refer to a sex buyer. Those are all common slang words that are used in the sex trade. They may be secretive about their whereabouts, or their stories about their name, where they're from, how old they are. Details like that might change, or they could have a tattoo that they're reluctant to explain, that could indicate branding. A lot of the times it could be someone's name or a symbol that's visible sometimes on the face or the neck. And keep in mind too that one or two of these doesn't always mean that someone is in a trafficking situation. It's typically a number of these red flags that we see in trafficking situations, but it could mean that something's going on. So I'm going to share hotline numbers that are 24 hours where tips are accepted at the end of the presentation, just so that if you ever feel like something's going on or see any of these red flags, you know where to call. These are red flags for labor trafficking. They may have unaccounted for time and vagueness concerning their whereabouts. They may be defensive in response to their questions. They may keep unusual hours, like being tired during the day if they were working all night. There may be signs of family dysfunction, including neglect, substance use of a caregiver, or abuse. They may have a debt that they're attempting to pay off by working. They wouldn't have access to their personal identifying documents. They may seem unable to leave a job or move or take time off, like typical employee rights that are afforded in a safe work situation. There would be signs that that's not what's happening. Unpaid for work or compensated very little. They may live with their coworkers, be transported to and from work by their boss. That's very common in labor trafficking situations, and that would then give the trafficker more control over the victim's movement. Moving on, this is a video that I will be sure to send out as well, because I really want to get through these case studies. These are some examples of how trafficking situations could play out in real life. The first two are fictional, and then we're going to take a look at a recent one. This one says, a couple befriends a woman with a developmental disability and promises her safety and shelter in return for help around the house. The victim is put to work in a family business for long hours every day, and she's not paid. She's told if she doesn't like it, they'll send her to a halfway house that's more like a prison. They cash her disability check monthly. The victim's family, who has lost track of her, finds her and brings her home. So in this situation, the woman was targeted for her disability. She was compelled to domestic servitude. They weren't paying her, and she was threatened with this idea of a prison. And they were also taking her disability benefits. So that would be a labor trafficking situation. This one says, a young woman grows up in a neighborhood where gangs control most of the commercial activity and the streets. She joins them for protection and a sense of belonging, and because there are few other options available. The gang tells her that she has to engage in prostitution and give them the proceeds to help them pay off a drug debt they owe to a rival gang. If she leaves the gang, her family, their home, and their business will be targeted for violence. When the gang is targeted in a police raid involving drugs, she is swept up by a trauma-informed police officer who understands the situation and connects her with appropriate support. So this would be a sex trafficking situation. This young woman was at risk because of the environment that she lived in, and the presence of gang culture, and the police identified what was going on and intervened in that situation. This is a very recent local Illinois case. that some of you may have heard of. My office was not involved in this case. This was actually out of Lake County. And while we're watching this, I would really like you to keep in mind what these victims were promised, what was being provided to them, how they were controlled. And we're going to take a look.
Lake County investigators say they have uncovered an apparent human trafficking situation at a home in Highland Park. A woman now is charged in the case. She's accused of forcing migrants into jobs to pay off debt. CBS 2's Andrew Ramos spoke with the woman's husband, who says it's all a lie.
Investigators here in Lake County say they were led by a tip to rescue 4 migrants who they say were entrapped, and the lives of their relatives back home in Mexico threatened if they did not pay off a debt. Investigators say they were led to this home in the 500 block of Anwencia Avenue after they received a tip last month of possible human trafficking. Then, on February 7th, a search warrant was issued where a 19-year-old woman and her 2-year-old son, along with a 22-year-old woman and her 15-year-old brother, were rescued. The 4 migrants from Mexico, officials say, were illegally brought to the U.S. last summer by this woman, 36-year-old Gladys Ibanez Olea, where she promised them housing and jobs, but soon after she confiscated their IDs, money, and other possessions, allegedly forcing the 2 adults and 15-year-old into jobs, having them work off so-called debt, warning them if they did not comply, she would have their relatives back in Mexico killed. Olea was arrested Tuesday, charged with 8 counts of human trafficking and multiple counts of involuntary servitude.
Yo leía una noticia en la que ellos aseguran que
Addams
And I actually just saw in the chat that Elaine mentioned this case at the beginning of the presentation. So thank you. And you know, if you look it up on recent stories, you'll find you'll find multiple examples in news articles about trafficking taking place, unfortunately, regardless of where you are. But that's just an example of how being undocumented and being, you know, language barriers and isolation all really contributed to the situation that these victims were in. Lake County does have their own task force. So luckily, you know, I'm sure that they were involved in some way. But also when you think about the location that this that situation took place and the profile of that trafficker, is that an area that you typically would think that trafficking would take place? Would you look at that woman and think she's a trafficker? But luckily, those 4 people were recovered, they're safe, and she's being held accountable for what she was doing. So we have all this daunting information about trafficking, but now you might be asking, like, what can I do about this? First, report emergencies or immediate threats of harm to 911. Next, you could report any tips of suspected trafficking to the Stop It or National Trafficking hotlines. I'll include those at the end, but also make sure to send those out. Those tips do go to law enforcement for further investigation. Next, we ask that you do not attempt to intervene, rescue, or confront a person that you think is being trafficked. It's very risky and could be dangerous for yourself or that person. They might not be prepared or ready to get out of their situation or report. So the best thing you could do if there's something in an immediate situation happening is to call the police or submit a tip to one of the hotlines I'll include, because they do take them seriously. They do get looked into, and it's just the safest route for further information to be gathered. Lastly, you could be a trusted, safe resource in your community. You could volunteer at a local trafficking organization. And I would say all of you taking the time to attend this presentation tonight is also a huge step that you're taking to help spread awareness. You could talk about what you heard here tonight, you know, discuss it with people, especially if you have young people in your life or anyone. If this topic comes up like that, it's a huge way that you can help us fight human trafficking. Speaking of volunteer opportunities, Stop It is actually hosting a volunteer training. They have positions on their 24-hour hotline and their drop-in center and a variety of other volunteer trainings. They have a spring training coming up on April 6th and the 13th Both of those days are required. They give you a thorough training on how to respond to these calls and how to respond to victims and be supportive in the best way possible. I'll also send this out, but this is the contact if anyone is interested. Oh, I also really want to mention that their hotline position is remote. So basically the hotline will get routed to you regardless of where you are. But even better if you're Chicago or Illinois based and have knowledge of like the resources in the area, but they will help you with all that. It is a remote position and you always have staff available as backup. So if you're interested, please contact Karen at this information here, and I'll be sure to send that out to you. So who is identifying like the trafficking situations and who are typically the first people to respond and help victims? It could be teachers. They see students daily and they have unique access to know more about their lives. You'll see a quote from a victim here that says, "I had a feeling my teacher knew something was wrong in my life. I would notice her looking at me almost like she wanted to say something. I wanted to open up to her, but I was afraid she would judge me. I was afraid she wouldn't understand." Right? So teachers are seeing children every day. It could be like a safe place where the child's away from their home and could disclose. So teachers are definitely a route for identification. Social workers and school counselors, they could engage with youth who are facing difficulty in school or acting out as a result of what they're going through. Healthcare providers are uniquely positioned to interact with folks from all walks of life who are experiencing exploitation, right? And I feel like all of these avenues have done a lot to get training on human trafficking and identifying victims, especially in the healthcare setting. Victims are talked to alone, right? Healthcare providers are treating them maybe in an emergency room and they can identify some of the signs that we've talked about. So these are some of the routes, and of course the police are all routes that have the potential to identify and help victims to safety. These are some Illinois resources that I will also send out. We have the Salvation Army Stop It program 24-hour hotline. That's how victims get referred to their services. Again, they take tips for law enforcement. And if you just have any questions about general assistance or trafficking in general, please feel free to call them. This is also the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Victims can live chat or text for assistance there, and they do accept hotlines as well. This is our task force's information. You can reach our task force coordinator and a pastor at the Salvation Army Stop It hotline number, and this is our website. I also want to mention that there are like 50 other task forces across the country that have the same federal funding that we do. So even if you're not local to Illinois or you know someone that you think could be useful to this work in another state, I definitely suggest them reaching out to their local task force, because 9 times out of 10, there is one. These are some additional resources that I'll send out as well. Love 146 has a lot of good information specific to youth and parents or grandparents on trafficking prevention for youth. We have legal assistance providers as well. And I also want to say too, regardless of what industry you might be in, there's definitely a way that you could help trafficking survivors and help fight trafficking as a whole. Like whether you work in healthcare or the legal field, or even know people that work in those industries, or it's something to do with social media, like there is definitely a way you could either get training for your staff or recommend training to someone's staff or spread information. There's definitely a role that anyone could play in fighting human trafficking. I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but this is all of our social media pages for the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force. We have a TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. The TikTok is especially useful for youth that might already be on the app, and we started that to fight a lot of misconceptions that exist on TikTok about trafficking and sex work in general. So I will definitely send this out as well. And this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out with anything, any follow-up questions, to request another training. And there's also a QR code here you can scan with your cell phone camera to do an evaluation. And that concludes my presentation for the night. I really thank you for your time, and I think we still have a few minutes for questions if there's anything I can clarify. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Elisa. I do have a question. I just recently read this statement. It's estimated that 50% of individuals affected by sex trafficking are male. Advocates argue that the percentage may be even higher, but that male victims are far less likely to be identified. And LGBTQ boys and young men are particularly vulnerable to trafficking. Has that been your experience?
I have definitely worked with male victims of both sex and labor trafficking. I don't know the exact statistics, but I will say that male victims are like much less reported than females, which is why I think we might not have the full scope of how males and boys in the LGBTQ community are affected, but they are definitely victimized as well in both arenas. So I would say that that's true, yes.
I was wondering too about refuges in Cook County. Are there enough?
As far as shelters,
Mm-hmm.
there's not, unfortunately, because especially with trafficking, we're sharing basically shelter space in domestic violence shelters. There aren't trafficking specific emergency shelters where someone can go and get a bed 24 hours a day. So we utilize the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, but now we're talking about 2 gender-based violence issues, you know, and there's constantly a need for more beds and like more space. So there is a huge lack of emergency shelter, I would say. And even then, victims don't always want to go to a shelter. They can be very restrictive. They might not be used to, you know, what the victim's used to, or they could have stayed in a shelter in the past and not had a good experience. There could be a number of reasons why they're opposed to going to shelters. But, you know, even when they do want to, there's not enough spaces.
Okay, Marianne asked, do you have safe harbor laws in Illinois?
I am not sure. Are you referring to like if a child victim is recovered?
Marianne, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, start video. I'm referring to laws that do not criminalize the victims, but rather focus on rehabilitation for them and have funds in place for them. In Iowa, we really don't have funds to deal with the victims of human trafficking. This year in the legislative session, we're asking for an amount of money to actually try to service victims to help rehabilitate them. So, and then when they are identified by police, they're not arrested as a criminal, but rather they're a victim because of the circumstance. So some of the states have the laws, but they're in different forms. I just wondered what was happening in Illinois. And are there funds in place for rehabilitation for the victims at the state level in Illinois?
So prostitution is not really being prosecuted anymore, like as far as we're concerned. We're not like trying to get women involved in the sex trade in trouble. So I would say so. And even buyers, if we come across a trafficking situation, we will more than likely try to use the sex buyer as a witness in the case against the trafficker, as opposed to like charging the trafficker. I'm sorry, the buyer, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, and also just a point of information, in Iowa, we were the first state to have school bus drivers have human trafficking training before they got behind the wheel, because so many times when they're dropping students off, both parents, or if it's a single parent, is working, and there are people hanging around. So do you have that law in place in Illinois with school bus drivers? Do you know that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think it's a good opportunity for training.
Yes, it would be.
For sure. So thank you for the idea. And I do know there's an organization called Truckers Against Trafficking. I
Right.
think they're national, but that's basically a movement of truck drivers who work to like raise awareness around the issue that happens at truck stops. But I will definitely look into it and can get you an answer about any laws we have for school bus drivers.
Thank you. This has been very, very enlightening. We
Thank you.
have a human trafficking program this last year in AAW in Iowa, and we decided to educate Iowans because many times they're not familiar with it or they don't really understand trafficking. So we have designed brochures that are being distributed statewide from about junior high age on, with information that you included, but in a much simpler form for those basic information. So we're trying to distribute those in a variety of areas. And the good thing about it is it's a nonpartisan issue in the legislature. So both parties can, take responsibility to see that things are done, and it makes it much simpler in that direction, because many states are very split right now politically.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for doing that.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question that ties into that. My daughter teaches in a low-income high school. I live in Lamont, but this is closer by. Anyway, she does have to deal with pregnant teenagers in her classes, and all kinds of questions come up. Do you have any kind of a program that you could melt it down to the point that would help these students? Because they deal with these things that you talked about all the time. And I just think if you make these children feel free to come and talk about these things, that maybe they won't fall victim to them, to these traffickers.
Absolutely. And we actually have a child trafficking subcommittee. And within the last year or so, we developed a youth trafficking training that we're just now rolling out at different schools that we can get into. So if your daughter's interested in that, we would love to connect with her. But recently we did basically an entire middle school in Calumet Park, 6th through 8th grade. And we basically gave them like a youth centered version of this presentation that touches on like healthy relationships and online safety, and how traffickers are recruiting victims online, and all these basics for their own information. And you'd be surprised at how much they already knew about trafficking and what they're seeing in their own communities, and how eager they were to talk about it. I was like just blown away by it all, and we really want to like do that in many schools as possible, and in as many youth programs as possible. So that is an option, and if anyone else is interested in that, please reach out, and I would love to talk to your daughter about getting into her school.
Thank you.
There was a question on the chat from Tina. How widespread is it known about ways that victims can send signals, such as hand signs for help? Are things like that being conveyed to young people?
I don't know that is like a super common way that victims are asking for help, or that victims are being identified, at least not in my experience. So I can't really speak to that as far as like a hand signal. But I do think like training other professionals and in identification and making like these hotline numbers accessible to victims in a way that they can understand or identify, even if it's not using the words human trafficking. I think those are like outreach methods that are a lot more effective and most common in helping victims like identify with the situation that might not be safe that they're in.
Are there any other questions for Elisa? If not, I want to offer a huge thank you to you, Elisa, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight.